In August 1946, the McMahon Act forbade the disclosure of US nuclear information and necessitated the development of Britain's own nuclear deterrent program, the V-Force. The British Strategic Jet Bomber specification was issued in 1947. It called for an aircraft capable of carrying a 10,000-pound load at 500 knots, with a range of 3,350 nautical miles at a ceiling of 50,000 feet. The bomb load, which was to be housed internally, was to be doubled over shorter ranges. The 8 major British aircraft manufacturers all entered designs. Among them was a proposal from Avro and Company at Chatterton near Manchester. It was an all-wing design based on German research data. After a series of major alterations and refinements, a revolutionary wing shape was decided upon, almost a pure triangle like the Greek letter D, hence the universally adopted name, Delta. This was to be the world's first Delta wing jet bomber, the Vulcan.
Saturday, the 30th of August, 1952. The first Vulcan prototype was ready to fly. 4.5 years of intensive work had gone into the making of this aircraft. It was a huge aeroplane and quite unlike anything of its size that had flown before. But its test pilot was full of confidence.
Clear to taxi, runway 26.
Unlike the launching of a ship, the first flight of an aircraft is not a ceremonial event. The only people present were a few of the firm's staff, to whom this day meant so much.
The first Vulcan flew from here, piloted by our chief superintendent, he was of test flying, Rolly Falk. He came out of the building here, pointed over to the flight sheds, taxied down the runway, turned it round, did all his checks.
698, takeoff. 698, Woodford Tower, cleared for takeoff.
By halfway down the runway, it was airborne. It was airborne for 2.25 hours. Now, that particular day, believe me, it stopped the whole of Cheshire, the traffic, everything, ground to a standstill, because they'd never seen anything like this at all. They thought it was on the amount of space. He really was terrific. It was a terrific day in aviation. When Rolly Falk flew the Vulcan down to Farnborough and then he brought it back to Woodford, as he was coming back, he came over the new assembly, that's the name of our workshops here at Woodford, and he rolled it like a fighter. We couldn't believe it, that such a massive aircraft could be rolled. And he smashed all the glass in the roof of the new assembly, and it was like that for a long time, all taped up, till the roof was redone. I've never forgot that, and even the crowd that was here, and all the workforce thought it was terrific.
As well as a high degree of maneuverability, the Vulcan showed an exceptional rate of climb and descent. It could lose 20,000 feet in 90 seconds flat, and recover to level flight in only 1,500 feet.
Here we go. Internal checks, pilots, PFC order, cells and fuel. All off, all lights on. Main warning lights. Out. Out. Helmets. On. Director horizons. Corresponds. Go film heating.
Low check.
Safe football.
Safe lock starboard.
Reminder, am I? 3 right. Bomb doors emergency switch. Canopy pointers. Safe football.
Safe lock starboard.
Bomb bay fuel pumps.
Off.
Accelerometer. Set. Start engine selector switch. Is to normal. Ignition switch is on. Up to 15. Start 3. That's on.
In the early 60s, early warning radar would give the V-Force a 4-minute warning in the event of a surprise missile attack. Vulcans stationed at this base could be scrambled in just under 2 minutes. Vulcans were equipped with a mass rapid startup facility where all 4 engines and electrical avionics would come to life almost instantly by pressing a single button in the cockpit. The Lincolnshire bomber bases reached the highest degree of alert readiness in October 1962. As the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded, the Valiant, Victor, and Vulcan V bombers were armed and stood combat ready for a period of 3 days. Pilots and crew lived alongside their aircraft, poised for the alert klaxon, which fortunately never sounded.
The tender submission by Avros was a Delta 4-jet aircraft. The advantage of the Delta was you could get everything inside. It made a clean aeroplane in the sense that it created very deep wing sections which would house the engines and at the same time all the fuel tanks and permit the bomb compartment to be in the fuselage, which meant that you could fly at very high speed. That's at the beginning. Then the problems start. Somebody had to decide that you were going to actually cut metal and start really doing it.
In the company's wind tunnel at Woodford, the aerodynamic characteristics of the new planform were thoroughly investigated. So little was known of the practical behavior of the Delta wing that an unusual decision was made. Experimental aircraft, exact third-scale replicas of the new bomber, were built for research into the handling characteristics of aircraft of this shape. It was at this stage, early in 1950, that Mr. Rowley Falk joined the company. Mr. Falk probably knows more about Delta wing aircraft than any other pilot. He began development flights at a crucial stage.
2 third-scale research aircraft were built to try out the flying characteristics for the projected bomber. The 707A was made for high-speed flying, and the 707B for low-speed handling. As soon as we were thoroughly satisfied with the low-speed handling of the Deltas, I started on testing the high-speed aircraft, the 707A.
It was the first time any Delta wing aircraft had flown in Britain, and it aroused great curiosity, which wasn't entirely confined to the aeronautical profession.
During all the Delta test flights, automatic cameras recorded readings on the dials of the 24 instruments. The film was removed for immediate development after each flight, so that the readings of every instrument at known intervals of time could be examined.
While all this research was going on, a full-scale mock-up of the Vulcan was built. In addition, the company installed several new test rigs. In this rig, the power-operated flying control system has been laid out exactly as planned for the aircraft. Typical movements applied to the stick by the pilot could be reproduced, and the responses of the controls analyzed. On the same rig, large lead discs represent the mass of the ailerons, elevators, and rudder. Hundreds of hours flying could thus be condensed into a short space of time. On the hydraulics test rig, the undercarriage was tested under loads representing conditions of actual flight. Another test rig was built to examine engine bay installations and to check pressures and temperatures. Because of the extreme altitude at which the Vulcan was to fly, some special research was also needed on the pressure cabin. This was completely immersed in a water tank and water pressure applied to the inside. Special research was also conducted on the window glass, which was tested to destruction. Glass panels were mounted on a frame representing the windscreen, and the assembly bolted to the steel cover of a pressure vessel. A complete aircraft was also built for structural tests, and has successfully withstood loads exceeding the design requirements. Only 3 days after its first flight, the prototype made a dramatic appearance at the SBAC display at Farnborough. Falk flew it alone. This 50-ton aeroplane could be flown single-handed. The production of the Vulcan had been planned from the time when the aircraft was just a pencil outline. 50,000 special tools had to be made to put the first squadron of Vulcans into the air. Each aircraft is built up from over 100,000 separate parts. Shown here is a universal rib assembly jig. Each rib, exactly made, has its place in the wing assembly jig. In this 5,000-ton rubber press, large parts can be produced in one operation, thereby lowering costs.
The wings were built in the jigs here at Woodford, but the centre sections were shipped from the Chadderton factory in Manchester to Woodford for assembly. Now, we used to bring the centre section up from Chadderton to Woodford in the early hours of the morning, say between 5 and 6 o'clock. And to make sure that we were in the safety factor, all the lampposts along the A6 coming from Manchester right up to practically through the Stockport area, they were hinged so we could get past them and then put them back. And the company paid for all this. It was a very big operation because the centre section is a massive size and they had to have a police escort.
Ingenuity with excellence of aircraft design have combined to produce a bomber of immense striking power. But the ability to design and build a beautiful-looking aircraft which meets its original specification isn't enough in itself.
During the flight testing of the Delta aircraft, the simple Delta wing created problems in the sense that buffeting occurred at the wing tip, reducing the ability of the aircraft to achieve its critical Mach number.
The Avro flutter and response simulators can tell aircraft designers precisely how their project will react to control movements or disturbances in the air when it flies. Here, the simulated disturbance to an aircraft damps out quickly. At a different configuration, the same disturbance leads to a nosedive. Added to these aids is the very latest digital computer, popularly known as the electronic brain. The problems translated into perforations on a roll are fed into the computer. Calculations which would have taken a month can now be condensed into a matter of minutes.
The solution was to modify the leading edge sweepback, which was that, to sweeping that part of the leading edge forward, and at the same time doubling the chord length, and this was the shape that ultimately became the production version of the Vulcan.
In August 1956, 230 Operational Conversion Unit was set up at Waddington to train crews on the new aircraft. With 83, 101, 50 and 44 squadrons all based here, the giant white Delta with the Red Cross of Lincoln emblazoned on the tail fin was soon to be a familiar sight over the Lincolnshire countryside. Continuously training on the new type, the Vulcan crews were achieving consistently good results in bombing and navigation exercises. Vulcans from 83 Squadron were selected for goodwill tours, including, ironically, a trip to Buenos Aires to mark the Argentine presidential inauguration ceremonies. This classic footage from 1959 tells some of the story of the Vulcans at Waddington, while neatly avoiding detail of their sensitive and less savory nuclear armaments.
Responsible for the instrumentation and countless number of pieces of electronic equipment, this section does its job to keep the massive aircraft flying. 4 Bristol Olympus jet engines power the Vulcan. Only the best aircrews are selected for V-Force training. Captains, co-pilots, navigators, and air electronics officers must have wide experience in their respective roles. Their personal qualities count too, and until they're ready to embark upon their air training, they attend extensive specialized ground courses. A fully fledged crew is ready to take to the air. As in civilian airports, buses take them to their aircraft, which awaits them at dispersal. What fantastic machines these Delta wings are. There are 14 miles of electric cables in each one of them, 9,365 feet of tubing, and, not including the engines, over 167,000 different parts. Hundreds of thousands of nuts, bolts, washers, and rivets hold the gigantic machine together.
The electrical power generated by the Vulcan would have lit a small village. Although I have 4 generators, one on each engine, any one particular generator would have kept the aeroplane in flight and kept it securely supplied with electricity for all that it required to do. If one were unlucky enough to lose all the generators at very high altitude, then the pilot could pull a handle which would drop out a ram air turbine. It would give you 13 kilowatts of power and allow you to descend and keep the flying controls working.
Local control gives the okay to take off. The altitude of the airfield, temperature of the day, atmospheric pressure, all have to be taken into account. The takeoff speed is usually around 130 to 140 knots.
Starboard one is reading also 70 knots, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, check speed is okay, 130, 135, on stick, thank you very much. Roger, understand transition 3,000 feet, flight level now 40, climbing, Delta 83, listening out.
Here they are, thousands of feet above the ground in a world of their own. How graceful they look, how different they seem, in the element to which they really belong. Sometimes on clear days we look up to the sky and see vapor trails like this.
Day came when we had the electronic countermeasures. The ECM was very advanced for the time. There was a tail-looking radar, which was very good, known as Red Steer. We had a transmitter known as Red Shrimp that incorporated 3 transmitters that covered the entire communications band and the radio and television. On one of our first sorties up in the northeast of England, just off the coast, we operated the equipment, and to a lot of people's annoyance, we caused a lot of trouble with their radio and television for about half an hour. The usual thing after that was that we had to put in a 24-hour request to the government, and it was a cabinet decision that would allow us to work the ECM.
Everything they've been taught on previous dual exercises is now put into practice. High-altitude bombing and navigation sorties, the practicing of emergency procedures, instrument flying and control approaches for landing. Control, dissatisfied with their line-up with the runway, tells them to overshoot and try again.
Cruising right to left towards runway extended center line. Just half a mile to go. Still slightly right of center line. Unable to get you in off this approach. Look ahead and overshoot. Delta 83, Waddington talk down, listening out.
Delta 83, overshooting.
On the 23rd of July 1959, we were to take off in Vulcan XA891 for an engine development sortie. As we took off, I noticed that I had some lights coming up that ought to be out, and then eventually I had 7 lights, all red lights, to tell me that we'd lost all our electrical power. And I informed the captain of this, and he requested what I would like him to do, and obviously I said to land immediately. But it was apparent that we didn't have that facility, and so he just said climbing, and we climbed to 16,000 feet. Having tried all the tricks we knew about, switching off all the generators and trying them on individually, nothing would work. The captain decided that we would head further east and try and get the aeroplane away from high-density population areas. And he tried to make an attempt to get into Waddington, but on the instant of him trying to disturb the aeroplane to turn right onto approximately a 90-degree turn, the aeroplane went into a flat spin, and he then shouted, "Bail out, bail out, bail out." On came the abandoned aircraft light switch, and off I went, and my parachute deployed. And thankfully, we all 5 made it down to the ground, and at that particular time, we were the only complete crew to have successfully escaped from a Vulcan.
The V-Force was becoming an extremely efficient organization with a strong nucleus of select star crews, the highest V-Force classification.
Only the best air crews are selected for V-Force training. Captains, co-pilots, navigators, and air electronics officers must have wide experience in their respective roles. Their personal qualities count too, and until they're ready to embark upon their air training, they attend extensive specialized ground courses.
In 1958, the 3 Vulcan B-1 squadrons gradually assumed the role of spearhead for the British nuclear deterrent. Airmen were assigned to quick reaction alert duties once a week, plus 1 weekend in every 3, standing by for the alert none of them wanted to hear.
Scuttle! 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 Scuttle!
flying side of the station's activities goes into action. No time now for unnecessary formalities. No time for anything except to get the aircraft off the ground fast.
Vulcan cockpits were fitted with shields for protection against nuclear flash. Only the forward vision panels were exposed during takeoff. During the remainder of the sortie, the whole cockpit was blacked out, the route being flown solely by radar. In 1960, the first bigger and more powerful B-2 Vulcan was delivered to the RAF. This was XH-558. It arrived at Waddington on the 1st of July that year. The B-2 had a 111-foot span, 12 feet wider than the B-1, with increased range, speed and capacity. It was designed to carry Britain's new nuclear weapons, blue steel.
A glimpse of secrets, the new standoff bomb carried under a Vulcan.
After a complex fail-safe pre-launch procedure, which involved the first pilot, both navigators and the AEO, the missile could be fired 100 miles away from the target. In 1963, anti-aircraft missiles had been developed to such an extent that high-level missions were no longer viable. The Vulcan, with its robust airframe, was the most suitable V-bomber for low-level operations. It was repainted in light grey and dark green camouflage and had new bulges housing terrain-following equipment.
When I joined the Vulcans, we were still maintaining QRA, which was the famous 4-minute warning. Each station at Scampton and Waddington maintaining 3 aircraft at readiness on the ground. Now, those aircraft would never fly except in the event of a war. They might taxi as part of a practice scramble, but never get airborne, because they, uniquely among the Vulcans, were sitting armed with operational nuclear weapons. Part of the V-Force posture was that, although we were based at Scampton and Waddington in the United Kingdom, in the event of a war, we would disperse to other military and civil bases across the country, so you don't have all your eggs in one basket. And then in the event of a 4-minute warning, there would be 4 Vulcans getting airborne from perhaps 20 or 30 different airfields around the United Kingdom to give us the chance to get airborne and disperse before any incoming nuclear weapons can take us out. Our role then was part of the British nuclear deterrence, and our target obviously part of the Warsaw Pact. The way we intended to deliver the weapons was low level. By day we would fly the aircraft by hand, looking out the window as low as we dare go, I guess 50 feet. Our training, we never went below 300 for safety reasons, but operationally I expect most pilots been well below 100 feet. At night or in bad weather we had a special modification, a terrain following radar, and you didn't need to look out, you merely followed, again, electronic steers in the cockpit, and that was selectable as low as 200 feet. The entire mission would be flown at those sort of heights, and obviously the weapon, when released, had a long time delay built in before detonation to allow the Vulcan to get clear of the effects of the blast. Unlike the Americans, who used to maintain an airborne alert with nuclear weapons, that we never ever flew for training purposes with the weapons on board. They would have been loaded prior to dispersal to our bases in the event of a war. How people felt about it, it's difficult to say. It wasn't talked about, it wasn't discussed. I think it's a question of having faith in the system. We did not believe we would ever be released to drop those weapons except in extremis, presumably following a nuclear exchange which another country had initiated. I don't know anybody in 9 years that I was on the V-Force who ever had any qualms about the job, and I don't know anyone that you wouldn't have thought would have been able to do the job and be there on the day.
If one compares the maneuverability of the Vulcan with other bombers of the day, such as the American ones, perhaps the B-52, there is just no comparison at all. The Vulcan had almost fighter-style performance and turn radius, which was quite sparkling by the standards of the day. This very satisfying handful of throttle levers here was the medium through which the pilot controlled the 4 Olympus turbojets, totaling 80,000 pounds of thrust.
You could have a simultaneous 4-engine start by pressing this center button here, which was quite an amazing experience, having pressed the button. There'd be a sudden rush of noise, sound, and as you look back, everything seemed to be happening on the center console, or the center instrument panel, with everything suddenly coming alive. And in a very short space of time, you could be on your way.
Car checked. 60 checked. 100, 110, 120, 130, decision rotate. Indicator, selected 3 minutes. Steers in. Okay.
In 1969, the role of Britain's nuclear deterrent was handed over to the Navy's Polaris submarine fleet. By the early 80s, the Vulcan was being phased out for replacement by the Tornado. Events in the South Atlantic, however, were to change that view. On the 1st of May 1982 at 10:50 p.m. local time, 2 Vulcans and 11 supporting Victor tankers took off from Ascension Island. The first sortie of Operation Blackbuck was underway. The target? Port Stanley Airfield. 3 days later, Captain John Reeve left the safety of Wide Awake Airfield to begin the second. The flight would take 16 hours, during which time the Vulcan would be refueled 5 times. This was to be the longest bombing mission ever mounted. After descending to 300 feet to avoid detection on enemy radar, Captain Reeve began a rapid climb to 16,000 feet. The attack had begun.
I would have felt frightened had we gone for a daylight raid. With a daylight raid, anybody who's got a gun can fire at you. With a nighttime raid, you're looking for technical electronic systems that can bring you down. We had the technology to combat those, and while the individual Argentinians, I've no doubt, were very brave and very competent pilots, I don't think they had the depth of technical expertise at sergeant, chief technician level to keep their kit right at the top line to make it work. Moreover, we had the advantage on the Vulcans. We were the first raid, and the first raid has always got the advantage of surprise. No, in all honesty, I thought our technology, old though it was going to be quite good enough to get through the defences of the Argentinians by night. By day, a different matter.
With bombing radar technology from the 50s and the known inaccuracies of the Vulcan system, the best chance of hitting the runway was to fly across it at an angle of 30 degrees and release the 21 1,000-pound bombs at quarter-second or 50-yard intervals.
When it came to the Falklands, there was no need to bomb from 40,000 feet. It was deemed, after a lot of thought, unwise to bomb from very low level, as that would put us within the range of Argentinian anti-aircraft fire. So we elected to bomb from 20,000 feet. And as we said at the time, we've spent the first 20 years bombing at high level, the next 20 years bombing at low level, and the one operational sortie we do, we bomb at the one height that no one had ever even considered in nearly 40 years of Vulcan flying would be relevant. It worked. One of the other considerations in picking the bombing height for the Falklands was the ballistic performance of the bombs. And there was some concern that if you dropped them from low level, there was a possibility with the low angle of grays that they would ricochet off the runway rather than actually penetrate and explode. Obviously dropping from 10, 15, 20,000 feet, not only is there more velocity on the bomb, but the point of impact is such that the bomb certainly isn't going to ricochet and will certainly penetrate and get through to the subsoil under the runway.
Closing on the target, the air electronics officer turned on the Vulcan's powerful electronic countermeasures equipment to jam the enemy's fire control radar, which was trying to lock onto the bomber. 2 miles short of the target, the bombs were released.
There was nothing that we could actually look down and say, that's Port Stanley and there's the airfield. But again, it didn't matter. The Vulcan has been designed to drop bombs by radar from day one. So from my point of view down the front, all I was doing was following electronic steering information, left, right, and in front of me a little needle was ticking down the range to bomb release.
20 seconds later, they hit the ground.
Our feeling was we were taking out a military target in a military operation, and I certainly had no moral qualms. I don't think anyone else in the crew. If they had, they certainly never spoke about it. We were perfectly happy with what we did. We'd have done it again.
One struck the middle of the runway. This was sufficient to render the airfield inoperable to Argentine jets that were such a threat to the task force.
The Argentinians would be aware of what was happening in the sense that, first of all, the frontline strength of the Royal Air Force is never a secret. It can't be in a society like ours. They were well aware that Vulcans would be employed if we were going to bomb the Falklands, in the same way as obviously Harriers would be involved from the carrier. They were also aware of the capabilities of the Vulcan, and our initial plan was certainly for low-level raids. This was subsequently modified when we discovered the Argentinians had installed fairly sophisticated anti-aircraft weaponry. The only other aircraft physically capable of carrying the 1,000-pound bombs were the Buccaneers. And in fairness, the Buccaneers were probably a more capable aircraft with a better bombing system. The problem, as I understand, is, as on many jet engines, when you're lubricating the rear turbine, the oil is destroyed in the heat and is subsequently dumped overboard. And all jet engines lose something in the order of 3 to 4 pints an hour, depending on their size. Now, the Vulcan was designed to fly for a very long time and has got an oil tank which can tolerate that kind of loss. The Buccaneer, designed to fly comparatively short sorties, would have run out of oil for its engines after about 6 or 7 hours. One of the things that we discussed as aircrew was the possibility of operating the Vulcan over Argentina. Now, not to drop bombs, that would have been a political disaster, but just to show the Argentinians that we had the capability of getting through the defences, which I'm sure we did. And if you were an Argentinian civilian, if you suddenly hear a bomber whistling over Buenos Aires, big Delta Wing aircraft 3 o'clock in the morning making a lot of noise, we've got your attention. And one of the things that would have made the Argentinian Air Force do, as they did to a very large extent, is hold back their aircraft for home defence. Now, the Mirages, which might well have been escorting, were in fact being held back for defence of the homeland, and the only aircraft they were being held back for was to defend against the Vulcan, which is another contribution the Vulcan made to the Falklands War. Very definitely. One of the things that did strike me, I was involved in Desert Storm. I was flying one day with the VC-10 tanker. We had 2 Buccaneers on the right wing there to do the laser designating. We had 3 Tornadoes on the left wing, each I think with 3 1,000-pound bombs. So counting the tanker, we had 6 aircraft to drop 9 bombs, which is fine, and it worked very well. But I couldn't help but think at the time that the Vulcan could carry 14 laser-guided bombs in the bomb bay. They were slightly longer than the ballistic ones, so only 14. We could certainly have got 3 under each wing on the pylons, so one Vulcan could perhaps have done 20 bombs, probably 2 sorties a day. I think it's a shame in some ways we didn't have the Vulcan for Desert Storm. I'm sure it could have made another contribution, which would have been well worthwhile doing.
The operation to deliver 21 1,000-pound bombs to Port Stanley Airfield had taken a considerable effort out of all proportion to the bomb craters inflicted. But the effect of the attack on Argentine Air Force thinking and its combat capability was also out of all proportion to the damage. In 1984, XH-558, the first B-2 to fly with the Air Force, was selected to be the last, preserved for display flying. Its final role being to delight airshow goers as one of the most spectacular display attractions. The following sequence speaks for itself.
The Vulcan is due to arrive at 2:30 this afternoon. It's arriving in formation with the red arrows. Later in the afternoon, the strongest man in the world is going to attempt to pull the Vulcan, so that between 2:30 and just before 3 o'clock, you will get all the shots, the last shots that you'll ever get of an airborne Vulcan. If you are interested in Vulcan survival, go and... Good thing about the arrangement parking here, you get a very good close view of... The red arrows. Here they are. Which was the result of thoughts on paper in 46, passes slowly over the B-17. First 4-jet Delta bomber. A great big farewell written on one of the bomb doors. Designed originally as a high-altitude, high-speed bomber, cruising at near Mach 1, just below the speed of sound, at some 60,000 feet. The Vulcan, the last of the great Avro 4-engine bombers and maritime reconnaissance aircraft, going back through the Shackleton and the Lincoln to the Lancaster.